The war in Syria, 5 years after it began, is it any closer to an end? Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. What began in 2011 as protests inspired by the so-called Arab Spring quickly spread to an all-out civil war in Syria. According to the UN, more than 250,000 people have died in the bloody conflict and another 1.9 million have been injured. Meanwhile, 4.8 million people have fled the country in the worst refugee crisis since World War II. The war has helped lead to the rise of Islamic State, and it's seen the involvement of major powers like the United States and Russia. Now there are tentative efforts at peacemaking. We begin with CCTV's Yessa Hakim, who joins us from Cairo. And Yessa, peace talks are now underway. What can you tell us about that?
Yes, Anand, the peace talks are led by the UN envoy, and Mistura said that he received a vision of a plan from each side, the government of Syria and the opposition. He has two plans with him to discuss and to try to analyze and see how to make some kind of a satisfactory overall mapping out of the peace process that will be accepted by both sides. Now, the main issue, obviously, is the fate of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. What will happen with the Syrian president with a peace? If peace is struck, will he continue as president? Will there be an election, a new election? The opposition are calling for some kind of a presidential group or cabinet or coalition that will oversee the transitional period, whereby new elections and new constitution will be put in place, while the government is more looking at a coalition government that includes al-Assad, members of al-Assad's party, and a number of opposition leaders. But there is a lot still to be mapped out. Mistura is saying that he hopes he can get a coalition government on an agreement within the next 12 to 16 months.
Thanks, Yessa. That's CCTV's Yessa Hakim reporting from Cairo. And for more now, we're joined by Mohammed Ali. He is a Syrian journalist based in Damascus. He's reported from major war zones in Syria, including from Aleppo and Homs. Also with us here in the studio is journalist Rasha Ilas. She has reported from the Middle East for over 10 years, including the war in Syria. Welcome to both of you to the show. Mohammed, Russia announced a few days ago that it will be pulling its main force out of Syria. The Russian President Vladimir Putin saying that the Russians had achieved their objectives. How has that news been received in Syria, and what is your understanding of what objectives have been achieved?
Yes, according to the recent statements by the Syrian presidency, let's say the presidential office, it pointed out that this was not a surprising decision. This is something that was discussed and coordinated between the Syrian and Russian leadership due to the situation on the ground. And of course, here when we hear the Russians saying that they have accomplished, let's say, their mission here, they mean that they have, to a great extent strengthened the positions of the Syrian army forces across the country against terrorist groups. Particularly here we're speaking about ISIL and al-Nusra Front. According to the Russians, we know that about 10,000 square kilometers were liberated because of the Russian aerial support to the Syrian forces on the ground, and also over 200 towns and villages were also secured by the Syrian army with the support of the Russian warplanes. Now, this is very important. We know that Russia, since the beginning, said and made it clear that it is not coming forever in Syria. It is coming to assist the Syrian army to eliminate the threat of terrorism. Particularly here, we're speaking about about areas close to central Syria and Latakia, and this indeed has happened, and the Syrian army is much more stronger now on the ground. I believe that the Russians have sent a very important message to both friends and enemies, particularly to Washington, that it was serious in actually fighting terrorism. It has done a lot in this extent, unlike the US-led coalition, and also it made it clear that it will be pulling out its major force also to pave the way for a political solution on the ground. However, we have to point out to the most important fact here, which is that despite the Russians pulled out most and the basic force over here, there are still warplanes fighting terrorism with the Syrian army. Just yesterday and today, Russian warplanes and fighter jets have been pounding the positions of ISIL near Palmyra, where the Syrian army is advancing, and expectations is that perhaps in the coming few days, Palmyra could be secured.
Okay. Russia, what is your understanding of the military status of this war right now? Has the Syrian government, as Mohammed is pointing out, recovered all this territory that was previously being held by Islamic State?
Yeah, well, let's make one thing clear. I don't think anyone believes that the Russians are actually targeting ISIS territory. Everyone has seen the maps and has seen the numbers. Most of the casualties from the Russian airstrikes have been civilians or people in non-ISIS country. What has happened is that in some parts of Syria, the Russian airstrikes actually made way for the Syrian regime troops to advance. Like, for example, in the northern side of Aleppo city and in other parts of the country. But but to think that Russia has sort of come onto the international stage and left as sort of victorious as as the main fighting power against ISIS, nobody believes that. But what Russia has managed to accomplish with these airstrikes is that they're now a main player in brokering the peace talks with the Assad regime. And what's really interesting is if you talk to Moscow insiders, they will tell you, listen, Moscow is not married to Assad. We do want to get a solution. We have very clear interests in Syria that we will protect.
In a sense,
but Assad is not the only one who will protect
in a
us.
sense, is that a message to the United States that the road to peace actually goes through Moscow?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Russia has been trying to do this for some time. And I think as soon as it managed to free up some resources from Ukraine and other parts of the world, it went in full on to sort of, create a legacy with Syria.
Right. Mohammed, let's look at the peace process. Peace talks are underway right now in Geneva. Some have referred to these current round of peace talks as Syria's moment of truth. What are the chances of the talks succeeding this time?
Well, the Syrian government has made it clear since the beginning of the unrest almost that it is actually willing to find a peaceful solution for the Syrian crisis. However, we know that the so-called opposition groups, especially those that are linked to Saudi Arabia's decisions, only want President Assad to leave power. And this is something that the Syrian government has made it clear that it will not discuss, because this is something in the end which is up to the Syrian people themselves and up to the elections inside the country, as no one has the right to choose who's the president or not except for the Syrian people. This is actually has been the problem since the beginning. The countries who are against Syria, against the Syrian government, like Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and also opposition groups who have been formed actually in those countries and who are known to be influenced by those countries, they also call for the same for the same thing. But in the end, the Syrian government is now again engaged in peace talks in Geneva. We know that just a while ago, Bashar al-Jafari, head of the Syrian government's delegation there, met with Staffan de Mistura, the UN Special Envoy to Syria, and he presented a worksheet, let's say, which includes what al-Jafari said, basic elements for finding a solution to the Syrian unrest. I believe those elements or principles are basically the same, preserving the unity of Syria and having dialogue without intervention. But in the end, I believe if a political solution should succeed, both sides should be discussing on the table of dialogue the main problems and not being influenced by any kind of country, whether regional or international country. Only Syrians themselves should decide how to share power, how to be living together inside Syria, just like before the unrest.
Right. Russia, what do you make of that? Only the Syrian people can decide who should be running Syria. These UN-sponsored talks that are taking place right now, it is a Syrian-led process, and it wants to establish here credible, inclusive, non-sectarian governance, which would ultimately lead to free and fair elections in about 18 months.
Absolutely. Only Syrians can and should decide about the future of their country. Unfortunately, so many players are now involved in Syria, and that includes Russia and Iran, who are staunch allies of the Assad regime. And of course, it includes Saudi and the Gulf states and Turkey and everyone else. So, you know, to say that only Syrians should make this decision, that would be great. But it's a little too late for that, especially with the peace talks. So let's get everyone on the table, everyone and their proxies who are on the ground, and let's keep in mind that when we say let all Syrians decide, let all Syrians decide, and I mean all, everyone, the Syrians who are in rebel territories, the Syrians who are displaced, the Syrians who are refugees, the Syrians who are detained and still in the regime prisons for political reasons. Let all those Syrians decide. And that's, I think, a major, major point that the Assad regime is still not accepting.
Do you think the United States now has to give up its primary demand that Assad step down before there's some kind of political settlement reached in Syria?
You know, I don't think it matters who makes that demand. Yeah. The voice is very clear in Syria. I mean, if you're anti-Assad, you want him to step down. But even if you're pro-Assad, I think Assad and the regime has sort of let you down in so many ways, because the country, you know, he has failed to keep the country together. He's failed to protect the Syrian people. He's failed to protect his own people. And he's failed to give guarantees for his people what will happen if and when, you know, he's out. Nobody will stick around forever. So, you know, if you're not anti-Assad and you're pro-Assad, you know, I would wonder, is Assad really competent enough to stay in the job? I would say no.
And Mohammed, what would be your response to that?
Well, I don't believe that the Syrian president or the Syrian army failed in protecting the Syrian people. In the end, this is an army which is facing terrorists coming from over 80 states, from the borders from Turkey, Jordan, Lebanon, from all around the world. And this was something declared by many countries. Now, this is a fact on the ground. You have terrorists flooding in from over 80 states to Syria to fight, including, of course, those of al-Nusra Front and ISIL. So actually keeping the country, keeping the Syrian government and institutions on the ground up till this moment, having the salaries being paid to the government employees, Syrians living normal life, going to schools and work, this is in itself is an accomplishment for the Syrian government. This is not a regular war. This is not something that has happened.
Syrians are not going around their normal life, except maybe in some parts of a government-run Damascus and some parts along the coast and some small, tiny part of government-run Homs. And the rest of the country, Syrians are trying to govern themselves under airstrikes and constant bombardment.
I suggest that you come to Syria before speaking from where you are.
Okay.
You know.
If you come to Syria, you see them living a normal life, and you see the mortars falling from militant-held areas.
We need to get
Despite that, they're still living a normal life.
I come to Syria all the time, and we hear this all the time that, you know, the terrorists did it, the terrorists did it, and that's fine. But I think a competent regime will be able to protect its country from so-called terrorists outside. I mean, the regime has failed to do even that.
Mohammed, I want to move to another political development. That is,
no country can keep what I'm saying is that there is no country in the world, if it faced the same what Syria faced, could actually keep all of its land secured. This is something for sure. You have all countries neighboring Syria working against it and providing all kinds of arms and facilitations on the borders. How in the world would be the Syrians living all across Syria in peace? But the Syrian government has made it possible.
If I can just interject one point. No president in the world says that his country is not for Syrians. President Assad said Syria is not for Syrians, Syria is for the people who protect it. I mean, it just goes above and beyond the imagination.
Okay, Mohammed, I want to move on to one other political development, and that is the... Sorry, one moment.
This is not something what the president said. Every time the president makes an interview, the West speaks contrary to what he means.
All right. The Kurds have declared the setting up of a federal system. This would unite the Kurdish provinces in Syria. Is that something that's going to be acceptable in Syria?
Definitely not. If it's not under the framework of the unity of Syria and under the framework of a sane united Syria, this is rejected. The Syrian Foreign Ministry has made it clear that this is not something agreed on and not something that it would accept. If you actually have the Syrians actually decide if they accept having Syria divided, they will definitely not accept that. I mean, the entire purpose of defending Syria, for the Syrian government actually, is to keep it united, is to keep a united country together. So having any kind of Kurdish federation or division in Syria, this is not going to be something agreed on or accepted by the Syrian government.
Right,
and also, this is not accepted by Russia or the United States.
Let me get Russia's view on that very quickly. Will Syria be able to hold as a unitary state, or are we going to see a kind of federal breakup?
I think the average Syrian wants the country to remain united, and I have to hold the opposition to that because they haven't done such a great job at sort of bringing in the Kurds and envisioning a Syria that's not just an Arab nation, but really a nation for all Syrians.
Right, and that is something that both of you agree on. Thanks to both of you for joining us. We are going to take a short break right now. When we come back, we will get a Russian and American perspective on Syria's 5-year-old civil war. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat. Welcome back to the show. The civil war in Syria has seen the involvement of major powers like the United States and Russia. Joining me now from Rhode Island is Vladimir Goldstein. He's an associate professor at Brown University, where he teaches Slavic studies. And he's an expert on Russian foreign policy. Also joining us in Washington is Michael O'Hanlon. He is Director of Research and Foreign Policy at the Brookings Institution here in Washington. Welcome to both of you to the show. Michael, there are now renewed peace talks, an effort to try and bring this war to an end. The United States' position has consistently been that Bashar al-Assad needs to step down before this process can go anywhere. Is that still the position, or is the U.S. now prepared to see him play some kind of role?
Well, I think the U.S. has already backed away from Assad stepping down as a precondition for negotiations, but I think it still advocates and calls for a broader power-sharing arrangement with him going by the wayside as that unfolds. So, you know, I used some fairly vague words to describe that. Those are the kind of words that I hear Secretary Kerry using himself. But I think it's pretty clear that the opposition is not going to let us go too far in that direction. That, in fact, if there were to be any peace deal at all, the opposition is going to insist that Assad be out of power pretty quickly, however one defines that. And likewise, Assad is going to resist. So I don't see the basis for the peace talks succeeding based on their current logic or the current framework and battlefield realities on the ground. I've got some other ideas we can get to later, but I don't see much hope because of this basic disagreement, this basic standoff on the two sides.
Right, Vladimir, let's look at the Russian involvement. Russia has been involved in this war. Its planes have been bombing targets in Syria. President Putin announced a few days ago that the main Russian force will be withdrawing, going back to Russia. Why has President Putin decided at this time to withdraw his forces?
Well, my feeling is that Putin feels that what he wanted to achieve in Syria, he has achieved. Whether we like President Assad or not, you know, he is an ally of Russia, and Putin wanted him to stay in power. Whatever position, it's not clear. So now, after all this, you know, 5 months of bombardment, you know, Assad is very strongly in power, and I think he has enough support from Russian military and his own army to be more or less in the chair in terms of the discussion of the future of Syria. And that's one of the objectives which Putin had when he got involved in that. Another objective which he had, you know, was probably, we can view it as some sense of proxy war. In other words, he wanted to realign Russia with its allies in the area, and he wanted to show that Russia is a major player in this area. And he also accomplished that. It's enough for us to see that, you know, Secretary Kerry is flying to Moscow next week, and, you know, Moscow is being consulted on practically every issue. Moscow also showed, you know, a real superiority of its, you know, firepower, electronics, radio equipment. They are now sort of securing certain contracts there. He also secured some kind of border with Turkey by installing some, you know, up-to-date weapons. So I think he accomplished what he wanted to accomplish, and leaves the rest for diplomacy. And I think opposition better, you know, negotiate, and they find the solution, because they are not arguing from the position of power, which is obvious.
Michael, what's your view on the Russian involvement and the subsequent withdrawal? Was this, as Vladimir points out, Russia's way of telling the United States that we are a major power that needs to be dealt with?
Yeah, I thought Vladimir's analysis was very good. I think I would agree with virtually all of it. I mean, we have to remember how Putin views the world and how he views Russia's role within it and what his goals have been in that context. I also think that President Putin does not want to be involved in this war indefinitely because of its budgetary costs and because it potentially pits him as the enemy of Sunni Islam and Sunni Muslims, and he can't really afford for that perception to intensify given the problems he's had historically with Chechnya and other Sunni Muslim extremist forces. So by having a limited intervention and then deliberately playing down his public role in that war, he can still have a quieter, more modest influence, but seem to be pushing Assad to peace negotiations and avoiding a big backlash from the broader Sunni Muslim world. So I think from his own perspective, he did achieve what he wanted. However, this is obviously a work in progress. Syria is nowhere near stable, and this can go in a million different directions in ways that could hurt Russia and or the United States, and we all have an interest in some degree of stabilizing the conflict. So I'm not going to give anybody too much credit until we see some kind of a stable outcome. In fact, right now I would say that everyone deserves some collective criticism, because even if they're achieving certain specific goals, and Putin in particular, I don't see this serving the interest yet of a stable Syria. Now, what Putin has done could help us potentially towards that outcome, or at least could be consistent with the pursuit of that outcome, but it's too soon to say that will be achieved.
Well, let's talk about that outcome for a moment. You mentioned a moment ago that the U.S. position on Bashar al-Assad is pretty ambiguous right now, and for that reason, these talks won't go anywhere. What's next then? Where do they go?
Well, my view, very quickly, I'm sure Vladimir has thoughts as well. My view is the confederation concept that the Kurds have recently introduced, but also that a few of us in Washington have been promoting, including a top former Obama official, Philip Gordon, who had been in government until just a year ago, that a confederation properly structured allows for Assad to continue to rule one sector of the country, and then for Kurdish and essentially Sunni Muslim areas to be created as well. But you would have to allow for minority rights, protection of property, protection of minorities in all these zones, and some loose confederal government structure could then be created to preside over it, and Assad would not be part of that. To me, that's the natural compromise, but we're seeing right now that the United States, Turkey, other countries are not at all willing to consider this idea. I think they're wrong, because I don't see any other way out of this problem.
Vladimir, what do you think? A federal concept for Syria, will that work?
Well, I mean, that's an ideal. Of course, what should happen, and I'm not foreseeing it, is I think, you know, major powers, major, countries which are interested in this conflict should somehow kind of back off and maybe begin to avoid this idea of proxy confrontation and let Syrian people decide and somehow figure it out. Because for the time being, we have too many forces, too many interests. Turkey on the one hand, Saudis on the other, US on the third, Russia is there too, and, you know, Kurds are in the middle. So it's way too complex. And until, you know, they've been prodded in one particular way or another, I don't foresee any kind of peaceful solution unless it just Assad asserts his power. That's one solution. It's probably not ideal one, but at least it would sort of stabilize the country and prevent it from civil war. But if other forces continue their policies, God knows what Erdogan in Turkey wants. God knows, you know, whether the United States is ready to accept Russia as an equal partner and negotiate with it. God knows whether the United States is ready to tell Saudi Arabia to back off its absolutely blind support of Sunni forces there. I don't know. It has to be seen whether sort of, everybody is ready for negotiation.
Michael, on the question of whether the United States is prepared to accept Russia as an equal partner in these negotiations, what are your thoughts on U.S.-Russian cooperation on this particular issue? I mean, we know that they have big differences on other issues, but on this issue and resolving the crisis in Syria, can they work together?
Well, going back to what Vladimir said initially on the show, I think he was completely right when he said that Putin wanted to be relevant. That was a big part of his goal in Syria, and I think he's essentially already accomplished that. I think Russia is already essentially an equal player in any kind of a realistic diplomatic process. I don't know, I can't remember who's sitting at which chair, which chair is a little bigger in the peace process in Geneva, but those kind of formalities don't really interest me as much as the basic core power reality, which is that anything that Russia wants in this is going to be central to the outcome, because Russia has supported Assad. He has allowed Assad to regain battlefield momentum, and Russia remains Assad's key ally, even with a reduced military presence. There's still military and financial support, the possibility of a Russian return in greater numbers of military capabilities. So Putin is already central to this. I don't think the issue is so much, therefore, Russian prestige. The issue is, can we figure out a plan that we can all live with? And right now, as your questions originally got at, the answer is no, because the United States is essentially insisting that at some point Assad must go, but also making the defeat of ISIS its top priority, and doing all that without committing much military force to the equation. So we have an inherently unrealistic set of competing priorities. Assad is not going to go. The opposition is not going to agree that he stay. So at the moment, we're nowhere. And that's the core problem. There's no plan that people will agree on.
And Vladimir, one other question is the role of Islamic State in this. Foreign Affairs magazine said recently that Syria is now home to the largest and most capable concentration of Sunni jihadist militants anywhere in the world. How does IS factor into these peace efforts?
I think, what Michael says is, I agree with him that, the United States does not have, clear policy. And your question points to this policy. They basically have to sort of sit at the table with Russia, I presume, and maybe other forces, and somehow solve this issue. Because if the game continues that Russia blames United States for supporting ISIS, or Turkey and United States blames Russia for bombing indiscriminately, for violating human rights, and doing the usual sort of propaganda things, we'll never solve it. That's precisely the ideal situation, ideal sort of area for ISIS to grow, while these other countries sort of at each other. So this is a high time for some kind of cooperation, not just only in the Middle East, but on many other dimensions. Having said that, we have to be realistic who is in calling the shots in Washington. We have the same establishment there in State Department. We have a lame duck president who is probably much more interested about his place in history rather than everyday concrete reality. Right. So I think until we have new president, nothing will be actually moving there.
Vladimir Goldstein, Michael O'Hanlon, thanks to both of you for joining us. And that's it for this edition of The Heat. We'd love to hear from you, so please send us your questions, comments, and story ideas to theheat@cctv-america.com. And we'd like to continue the conversation on social media. Give us your thoughts and comments on our Facebook page. You'll find that at CCTV America. I'm Arnold Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.